Hello and welcome back to part 4 of today's lecture series part 5, sorry, of today's lecture series in which we will be discussing a town in Syria, a Hellenistic city in Syria called Dura, Europos, and the religious pluralism and the multiple types of mystery cults and similar non-state sanctioned religions played out in this one particular place. So Dura is a city sort of on the interior of Syria. It's on the banks of the Euphrates River, raised up on sort of a plateau over the river. It is a desert space and it has a pretty wonderfully tight historical chronology to it. So it was founded around 300 BC as a Hellenistic city during the Hellenistic period. It is a sort of border town, right? It's on the banks of the river here, crossing over between, territorial boundaries. And it is then conquered by the Parthians in 130 BCE. These are sort of the successors to the Persians of the previous centuries. And then in 165 CE, it is conquered by the Romans and becomes a Roman border town. And then in 256 or 257 CE, there is a Sasanian attack. So yet another sort of successor people to the Persians here. The Sasanians attack Dura Europos, sack the city, destroy it, and after that the site is completely abandoned. So with desert conditions for preservation and a single event which stops the city's living functionality, that is a sort of wonderful recipe, like we've seen at Pompeii and other places, for extraordinary preservation, archaeologically speaking. And that we have here at Dura. So here are just 6 tiny examples of the kinds of things that we find preserved at Dura Europos. It was excavated in the 1930s, and all of this material was sort of taken out. Unfortunately, that's a bit early for very systematic excavation, but we do have at least photographic records of some of the material that was taken up. We get wood, we have textiles and rope, brightly colored, really beautifully patterned textiles are included here. We have shoes and sandals made of leather. We have a basket here with a leather covering. So all sorts of materials that are packing these houses and these town buildings at Dura Europos at the time of this siege and destruction are left there for thousands of years, and due to the arid conditions of the desert, they are well preserved for excavation later on. So this is a really extraordinary site in a lot of ways. It's pretty easily legible because, again, it doesn't have this extraordinarily long history of buildings upon buildings upon buildings. And during the excavation, things were so well preserved and so beautifully preserved as they were digging them up that they actually could do things like this. So this is one excavation photograph from 1933 or 1934. And because it was destroyed in a battle, a lot of the material that has been found at Dura Europos is military in nature. We get a lot of armor, we get bodies, we have weaponry as well. And this is the armor for a Roman horse, which once dug up, 1934 standards here. What do we do with archaeological material? We try it on, just like Sophia Schliemann way back in our earliest days of lecture. So here we have one of the workmen on the site reining a horse who is actually wearing ancient Roman armor, well enough preserved to be just draped on a pack animal who was locally available at the time. So here is a sort of aerial view of what Dura Europos looks like. So as I mentioned before, it's raised up on an arid plateau just over here at the edge of the Euphrates River, and farmland, right, to support the city is available down on the plains below the city. So Dura Europos is, in the Roman period, a military town, right? It's a border town. It is fortified. You can see here, even in this image, the wall around the outside of the city, which continues everywhere that someone could possibly climb up, although not around the side where we have this steep embankment. And then built into the wall of the city are a variety of religious structures, which is an interesting placement for them, especially in this case where the religious structures that we're looking at in this case are not the central state religious rites. They are our mystery cults or things that are similar to that. Now, Dura Europos has its own multicultural history, right? We have a lot of soldiers from parts of the empire here. We have local populations. We have Eastern influences meeting Roman influences and Hellenistic influences sort of all melding together. So we get a very distinctive artistic style coming out of Dura Europos. And to give you an example of that style, I just want to show you briefly. These are three fragments of reliefs showing the god Hercules or Heracles in the Greek. He's recognizable because of his club, his beard, and sometimes his lion skin. But as you can see, we've departed pretty far from that classicizing model of what a body should look like. And we have, again, that sort of larger head to emphasize the head of the figure over the size and stature. And the body is somewhat roughly hewn, sort of squat, with more of an emphasis on showing maybe the sort of graphic details or graphic impact of the body and also of the attributes of the god here. And the same is really going for this fragment over here that we see of the goddess Aphrodite, right? The pose is really recognizable to us at this point. She's covering herself, she's partially draped, she's got that sort of curvaceous, bodacious body that we're used to seeing, but the hand is somewhat carved a little bit schematically here. Likewise, the drapery, and even the sort of modeling of the body here is rather shallow and almost sort of an incised technique of relief, with a heavy emphasis on sort of shallow detailing. So a very different kind of artistic idiom is adopted in Dura Europos than we've seen elsewhere. And that carries, of course, into its non-state right religious cults, into its mystery cults that we're looking at today as well. Now, the first of these three religious structures that I want to talk about in Dura Europos more in depth today is another Mithraeum. No surprises here. So if we look at plan. You can see it here. It's not this dark one, it's the lighter one behind it. You should recognize that elongated kind of apse-like, almost church nave-like structure here that comprises the Mithraeum. It's built right up against the city walls and very close to the Roman camp. So we have our military associations here emphasized yet again in the placement of this Mithraeum. It's towards the city walls, towards the outside boundaries of the city. So again, separating it from that sort of civic heart of the space, to give some differentiation between that and the more official state religious rites and local religious rites. Here we see just an elevation drawing of what the inside of this structure looked like, and then an archival photo. I'm sorry, it's a little bit blurry, but it's black and white, of the in situ decorations of this Mithraeum. And here we can get a little bit more up close. So you might be able to recognize at the center, our expected bull slaying image is shown here in relief. We have a second tauroctony just below, also in relief, and they are inserted into this niche here, this arched niche at the back of the Mithraeum, which is covered in frescoes, both on the inner and outer parts. We have a ceiling, which is then also painted in fresco with red stars on a blue field. And then we have paintings along the sides as well, where the benches were, where the initiates would be sitting during rituals would sit. And then, of course, we have an altar in the center. So if you want to look at a color image, it's just not as clear on what the details look like. Here is a version of it. And the Dura Europos Mithraeum has been installed in the Yale University Art Gallery. So what you're seeing here is that sort of reinstallation, reconstruction of the fragments themselves. So these paintings are no longer in situ. Here is a handy dandy map which tells us what is actually going on in these various images. And as you can see, we have two images of Mithra slaying the cosmic bull. And then we have the sort of life and cosmogony, cosmogony, I can't say that, cosmogony of Mithras in small little images just set around that central image. Around the outside, we have these images of sacred altars interspersed with cypress trees, so showing this sort of sacred landscape scene. There also are images of the signs of the zodiac, so some sort of recalling the Zoroastrian heritage, heritage in quotation marks here, of Mithras as a Persian god, And then we also have images of Mithras and Mithraic prophets on the side, and then as a huntsman flanking the walls where the seats would be. So a closer look at the tauroctony here, we can possibly recognize some of our familiar figures. Here we have Mithras himself, the bull. We have a tiny scorpion down here, a tiny dog down here. We have our torch bearers here. And then it looks like we've got Sol Invictus above. But as you can see just off the bat, this is a very different looking images than the images of the tauroctony that we've seen both in marble and in painting from the Roman world in Italy that we've looked at before. So part of your assignment for this is to look more closely at these differences, so I don't want to dwell on them too much right now to give you space to think. So moving on a little bit, just to show you a little bit of the other imagery in this room, here is this Mithraic prophet that I was talking about before. And I think this is a really interesting piece to sort of zone in on the iconography here, because we have the dress of the familiar Phrygian cap of a Persian prophet. We have this interesting outfit that shows actually a different kind of dress, not quite so trousery as what we've seen on, say, Mithras himself or his flanking companions, Cautes and Cautoctodes. And then we have this sort of interesting stiff iconography, very linearly painted, without a whole lot of emphasis on spatial organization or representing perspective. So a sort of drive into this late, almost medieval style artwork, right, is on display in this late Mithraea, this painting from the 3rd century CE. So this may look very similar to some of the sort of Christian iconography of prophets that you've seen in other classes or in other contexts from the medieval period. We're sort of getting into this very frontal, organized, compositional way of thinking about art and representation with the almond eyes and the sort of frontal face and a stiff pose and sort of schematically represented furnishings around. We also have a beautiful use of color. This slide is just to show you a small fragment of the fresco with some of the more bright original saturated color. And then here is a piece of that hunting scene, right? And this sort of, again, looks yet almost in another register, right? So similar to maybe some of the earlier Minoan style ways and Mycenaean style ways of representing the natural world, where we have very curvy animals sort of represented in these moments of movement, maybe hunting scenes on Roman wall paintings. So this is recalling a little bit more some of the interest in representing the animal world as this undulating forms moving through space. That is a pretty familiar way of representing at least the movement of the animal world in our frescoes at this point. But again, this sort of medieval linearism showing up as well in our painting of Mithras himself as a hunter here. And then finally, we have, to just drive home this medievalism piece here, we have this fresco fragments of Sol Invictus with Mithras. And if you note here, Sol Invictus's once spiky headdress of sun rays has now turned into something resembling very much a Christian halo. You can see all of these tiny scenes. And then what I want you to do, since I'm out of time, is just to look carefully at that central relief of the tauroctony from Dura Europos and compare it to the other Roman versions we've seen, so you can look back at the PowerPoint slides from before and see if you notice anything. And then just write 2 to 3 sentences comparing the two styles. And think about if there's anything that you know about the culture of Dura Europos as a sort of border town, military, multicultural environment of this later Roman period. Is there anything you know about that might relate to these stylistic differences? So enjoy, and I'll see you in the next lecture. Thank you very much.